Hello, I'm David DeCosmo. Welcome to ECTV Live. I'm joined by my co-host, Rusty Fender. Rusty, welcome.
Good to see you, Dave.
Good to see you as well. Our guest today is Mark Rossetti Jr., who is with the Luzerne County Historical Society. And the Society has got a lot of events going. We think of them in terms of their museum and the various displays that are put on in that museum that vary over the year. But there are a lot more activities that the Luzerne County Historical Society is involved in, and some of them are be coming up within the next month and a half, and of course on from there as well.
Hi, Mark.
So we wanted to bring you in, Mark, to talk about some of those activities that maybe people don't always see that these are going on.
Right.
What is, for instance, the first that's on the agenda?
Well, the closest one coming up, we're actually doing a Revolutionary War encampment over the weekend at the Nathan Dennison House.
The dates on that?
Is the 17th and 18th of August, Saturday and Sunday. And we have 5 sites at the Historical Society. You mentioned our museum. That's probably our most famous one on Franklin Street in Wilkes-Barre.
Right.
We also have a research library that's also on Franklin Street. It's just down the block. We own the Swetland Homestead in Wyoming, Pennsylvania, and we have the Nathan Dennison House as well. And then we have another rental property that isn't open. But we do have 4 sites that are open to the public. So we try to rotate our events to the different sites to get people to see them all. Because, I mean,
Sure.
Oftentimes when we're there, you'll have people, oh, you know, I live in 44 my whole life, and I drive by this all the time, and I've never been here. I've never.
Yeah.
So we try to rectify that. So the first weekend, the main event that weekend is the Revolutionary War encampment. We're going to have the 24th Connecticut Regiment. They're a fellow nonprofit organization. They're a group of Revolutionary War reenactors. They tour the country because originally this was Connecticut. Still technically should be Connecticut, but that's a whole nother hour-long show we can get into. So they were our local unit, and of course the 109th descends from the 24th Connecticut. Little useless bit of trivia, you'll win a lot of bar bets. The 109th Field Artillery is the only unit in all 5 branches of the United States military that's allowed to carry 2 state flags. They carry Connecticut and Pennsylvania.
Oh, because our original Connecticut
Yes.
connection.
That is interesting, yeah.
So it's a neat little fact. So they will be there. They're going to have tents on site. They're going to have a blacksmith set up. They're going to have a medical tent set up. They'll be doing demonstrations. They'll be doing live firings. So it'll be a really interesting way to see.
This stuff is really amazing. I had the opportunity last, I guess it was either March or in early April. A friend of mine through his church has a Christian men's get-together where they have a shoot. The fellows bring their guns, and they have target practice. They have a little service as well. But one of the gentlemen that came there brought, in this case, it was a Civil War era rifle, and we all got a chance to fire that. And this is amazing because I think back, and of course, even now you go even more primitive to the Revolutionary War. But I think to myself, how on earth did someone fire one of these things at an enemy that's attacking and reload it in time to fire again? I mean,
It would dislocate your shoulder if you had it up to it with the kickback on.
I would fire once, and I'd have to put on the bayonet. Because,
Right.
And as I say, those rifles are earlier yet.
Yes, on the optimistic side, they have an effective range of maybe 100 yards, maybe, to put that into perspective. And as you talk about reloading, if you were very good, you could get 3 shots in a minute.
Oh,
the
my
vast
word.
majority could not even do that. I never could. I used to do. We've done at some of these events. They do the drills, the reloading drills, and everything.
Yes.
I can never get more than 2. And as you said, Rusty, the recoil was such that oftentimes, especially in the Civil War, we have more documented evidence of it. But even in the Revolutionary War, the younger enlisted men, they would actually tell them, well, if you're aiming for a man's chest, aim at his kneecaps, and then the recoil will bring the gun back up, and you'll hit where you were
That's
aiming.
interesting, I'll bet.
So it's an entirely different kind of flying altogether, as they say.
And these reenactors, they go to such effort to be accurate in terms of their uniform.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much of the weaponry is original or recreated to match the exact specifications of the original, but were you to see them, you would think it's exactly what was used during that time period.
The vast majority are modern reproductions, but as you say, they're basically impossible to tell. But the reason that's done is for safety purposes. When you do the battles and everything, you want to make sure that it's not going to detonate in your hand. You don't want anyone to get hurt. You don't want any spectators to get hurt.
Sure.
Several members, though, do have original pieces. They often display them. And when they're side by side, you know, if they didn't really tell you that one was new and one was old, aside from a few markings on it, you wouldn't really be able to tell.
You're right, though, with safety. You can't be packing live powder in 2019.
No.
I mean, that's just like checking your gas tank with a match. You know,
Yeah,
really.
so you take a few liberties. I know there was the running joke, we're talking about Civil War again, with the black powder revolvers. During the Civil War, you would actually coat them in bacon grease. Now, of course, you use modern wads to keep them from chain firing because it's a little bit safer. So to trade off some authenticity to make sure nobody's going to get hurt, it's worth it.
Do they do battle reenactment, something like that?
The 24th does. We don't do it at the Dennison House simply because we do not have the room. But the 24th goes around. They do a few. I know they do one at Sturbridge Village every year. They've been to Williamsburg a few times.
But in essence, if someone visits this encampment, they're going to see, in essence, what it would have looked like back when, in this case, Wyoming Valley, Luzerne County, when that area was being first populated and first protected by these either the regulars or the volunteers.
Correct. You're going to see the accommodations that the troops had. You're going to see the type of rations that they ate. You're actually going to learn all about camp followers. Units had different women that would do the cooking and the laundry, and they would be civilians, but they would actually travel with the unit from place to place to place and help them set up camp and do a lot of domestic work. They have ladies that reenact those as well. Oh. So you're really going to get a slice of what it would be like on a day-to-day basis in an American Army camp.
And you'll see all the historical state markers, too, that say Connecticut settlement, and now you'll know why.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's interesting, too, that we just had a program a few weeks back about an event down in Berwick where they have a reenactment of World War II events based on the fact that the tank was produced, one of the tanks was produced in Berwick. And now we're going back to see this. And of course, you know the history we just had in July, the annual services around the Wyoming Monument, which memorializes the settlers that were really massacred there by the British and the Native Americans. And this again would be the same type of uniforms and weaponry that was used at that time. Is there a charge to come and see this?
There is a charge. It's $7 for members of the society, $10 for non-members. You do not need a reservation. We'll sell tickets at the door, and it's both Saturday and Sunday for that weekend. From 11 a.m. to 4 p.m.
And the dates again?
The 17th and 18th, Saturday the 17th of August and Sunday the 18th of August.
Yeah, that sounds something well worth seeing. Actually, I ran across something like that in, I think it was part of Lackawanna County a couple of years back, and we didn't know what was going on. We were driving by, they were doing a battle reenactment, and I thought, gee, I've driven into the Twilight Zone.
Twilight Zone, I think of the same thing.
So, fortunately, it was a reenactment. I did not make that wrong turn to get to Ross Serling. Well, that sounds like a very interesting event. What's on the calendar coming up after that?
Well, that same weekend, that Saturday, the 17th, we're going to have the Swetland Homestead open for tours. This summer we have reopened the Swetland Homestead one Saturday a month as we are beginning to do renovations to the house.
All right, for those that don't know, let's a little bit of history on that.
The earliest part of the Swetland Homestead was built in 1803. And then it was expanded in 4 different stages before being completed around 1840. And it was built into its current form by William Swetland. He was actually the 3rd generation to live on the site. Luke Swetland actually was in the 24th Connecticut. He was in the fort. He was involved in the Battle of Wyoming. He was actually captured after. Interestingly enough, in the Battle of Wyoming, 4 men had to stay back to guard the women and children in the fort, so they drew lots. And the contemporary reports state that the men felt that they lost if they drew one of the lots. Luke Swetland actually was one of the 4. A few days later, he went to fetch water from the river. He was captured by the Iroquois, who actually took him up to upstate New York as a war prize. They did not kill him. And he eventually escaped, came back to the Wyoming Valley, found that it was basically abandoned after the battle, and then went up to Connecticut proper, back to his family. And so about 18, 19 months later, after they had long written him off as dead, he sort of showed up.
Wow.
And so he originally built the first log cabin and had received the land claim that the house is on in Wyoming. And then his son and grandson eventually expanded it. And his grandson, William, was a very big businessman, farmer, blacksmith, owned anthracite companies, owned railroad companies, was a big movement in getting the Wyoming Monument built and getting it constructed. So that's their homestead, and it's preserved pretty much the way it was when they lived in it in the latter part of the 19th century.
How about the interior of the Dennison house and the Swetland house? Were all the original artifacts as left moved to the museum, or is there anything in there that's of value?
There are still pieces. Now, everything in both houses is authentic to the time periods of the different rooms. Not everything, however, are family pieces.
I see.
Now, one of the things you'll get to see at the Dennison house, and I'm glad you brought this up because I forgot it in my little spiel, is you will actually see the capitulation table. You'll actually see the table that Colonel Dennison surrendered the Wyoming Valley to the British over.
How about that? That's interesting.
We have a copy of the treaty, which has been redone, but we have a copy of the treaty that's on the table and everything, so you can actually see where the valley was formally surrendered over. That's the big selling piece, obviously, for the Dennison house. For the Swetland homestead, probably about 40% of the items in the house belong to the family in different periods. Some of them ended up in the Pettibone house, which is also in Wyoming, which is now privately owned, but there are also items in there that were for the family as well. But the bulk of the pieces, 90+% in both houses, are period correct. They just didn't belong to the individual
That was
owners.
great. I know we got together over the holidays and did a special holiday feature, which sort of showed the evolution of Christmas celebration and even New Year celebration, if you will, through a certain period of time. Because and we think of putting up a Christmas tree now and all the decorations, and didn't start that way.
No, it was just another day for a long time.
I find it interesting too. The Pettibone house was sold off. Does that go into was this before the historic, the historic mandate of the day to spin that off into a public domain to be able to buy something like that?
Well, it was in 1958. Both houses were in the family. The Pettibones and the Swetlands were the same family. The Pettibones married into the Swetland family. So both houses actually ended up with Dorothy Dixon Dart, famously. She inherited the vast majority of the houses and the items. And so in 1958, she sold the Swetland house to us for $1 on the condition that it be a historic house, and she sold the Pettibone house to a local educational institution on the condition that it be their day school.
Long time ago, 58. So
yes.
This is 60 years this has been.
Correct.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
And at some point, the school ran into some financial trouble, and they sold it, one, to make a little bit of money, but two, historic houses cost a lot of money to upkeep.
They sure do.
So it was something to get off their books. Now, I have never been in it since it's been privately owned. But I'm told the family that owns it lives upstairs and that the first floor is correct.
Oh,
I don't know for sure, but I've heard that from a few people.
And you're right, it takes a lot of money. You cannot put vinyl siding on the Betsy Ross house.
No.
You have to have special PPG Manor Hall paints, which are historically, certified by the company to go onto the clapboards of the homes and all that. People have no idea when they buy a historical home. It's going to cost them 10 times as much to maintain this to historical accuracy and to the state mandate.
And it's not, obviously the money is a big part of it too, but part of it too is the logistics and the older ways of doing it. What we're finding now with the Swetland homestead, we actually have the money now, and we're calling places up because we want to change the roof, and a lot of these places say, I'm sorry, we just don't do wood shingles.
You're right.
And so you have to keep going down the list and going down the list and going down the list.
And we don't have a hammer, we use a pneumatic air gun.
Yes,
and you can't do that. It's got to be, everything's got, from the labor to the materials, has to be certified by that state. No conception. It's amazing.
That will get harder and harder. It's like
that's right, Dave.
It's like preserving and rebuilding the locomotives at Steamtown.
Exactly right.
Exactly.
You had
Yeah.
people that knew how to do this at one time, but we're losing those people.
Absolutely.
Unless you get some apprentices that have come along that know, and these are treasures. These are the Dennison House, the Swetland Homestead.
And you're right, David.
are
Every
treasures.
day that goes by is going to be tougher to get something
Yeah.
done and
Yes.
restored.
Yeah, in the exact fashion.
Exactly.
Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's a good career if you want to get into carpentry, if you want to get into woodworking, fabrication. If you learn the older styles and you become quite adept at it, you're going to have a career your whole life. It's a good way to get into it.
Sure. And fortunately, there are some young people that are, but probably not all that many. But at least there are some that are getting involved. Now that
And
event
this is a
again.
good area too. You know, the Northeast.
Oh, sure.
You don't have a lot. You don't have a lot of this in Kansas and Nebraska, but in the
Yeah.
Northeast, you know, the New England states and the Mid-Atlantic. This is where the history is.
I'm thinking of Salem, Massachusetts.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Lord, good
I
Lord.
visited there.
You could make a
number of
career
times.
just doing work in Salem.
Sure, sure. Now this event is at Swetland.
Yes, that is also Saturday the 17th. So if you want to come in, the tour is about an hour, maybe a little bit longer, depending on questions. I give the tours. So you can go there Saturday, go over to the Dennison House before it's over on Saturday, or go Sunday. You can hit both historic houses.
The timing
on one
on that?
weekend. It's also going to be 11 to 4.
Okay.
So both of them are 11 to 4. Swetland is just Saturday the 17th. Dennison is the 17th and the 18th.
Okay. How about beyond that? We got some plans. I know of at least one that to me is new, but you tell me it's a revival.
Well, we are reviving in September our battle walks for the Battle of Wyoming, which we were talking about earlier. Attorney Steve Killian, he's been on our board off and on since before the flood, I believe. He has great institutional memory. He gives the battle walks, and they are a 2-hour, 2-mile walking tour, and you actually go through the site of the battle.
All right. Now I remember from a program we did right here, special, with Bill Lewis about the Wyoming Monument. One of the things that a lot of people around here know about the Battle of Wyoming, and again, it was a lot of settlers that were basically wiped out by the British forces and Native American forces, and the battle is commemorated on the 4th of July at the monument itself. But what you don't always know is that the battle wasn't just, as a matter of fact, the main battle wasn't there. It was up the street in Exeter, if I recall
Yes.
what Bill said. And there's the rock
Yeah, the stone marker there.
where the executions were.
Yes.
So tell me a little about the logistics of this now.
Well, we meet at 4th Street and Susquehanna Avenue in Wyoming because now 40 Fort itself was just down a little bit down River Street in 40 Fort. There's a stone marker there as well. The state marker is actually where the municipal building is now. It was back a little bit behind that,
Which
but
is
that's
near the big cemetery.
yes, by 40 Fort Cemetery, and that gives you a good frame of reference. So then you go a few miles down Wyoming Ave through 40 Fort into Wyoming itself, and then we meet at 4th Street and Susquehanna Avenue because that is where they actually formed ranks. The Americans formed their battle lines. Because the weapons weren't very effective, as we talked about earlier, you would just stand shoulder to shoulder for several hundred feet in
One line
rows.
against the other
One
line.
lines against the other. And so the corner of 4th Street and Susquehanna roughly is where the Americans formed their ranks. Colonel Zebulon Butler, who was the American commander, gave a little speech, and then they began marching towards Exeter. The Schooley Farms was actually where the battle took place. It's now where Schooley Ave is. So, you go there, and that's roughly where the battle is. And when we get there, we explain how Wyoming Avenue was always there. They used to call it the Great Road, but it was probably a little closer to the riverbank than it is now. It's evolved over time. And how they followed the Great Road down. We get to where the battle site was, and we explain how there's two Butlers. The American Colonel Butler was Zebulon, and the British Colonel Butler was John, and they weren't related at all. So I always say the American Butler and the British Butler. How the British Butler lured the Americans into a trap. The British would fire, and then they'd immediately retreat while they were reloading, and then a few minutes later they would fire again, and then they would retreat. And so the Americans believed that they were actually pushing the British back. And after 3 volleys or so, the Americans had pressed far enough in that there were swamps on their left-hand side with Iroquois hiding in them. At this point, they're actually sort of ahead of the Iroquois. The Iroquois stand up, fire behind them into their lines, throw down their muskets, and then run in for hand-to-hand combat. Colonel Dennison from the Nathan Dennison House, he was second in command. He was in command of that side of the American flank. He ordered them to redoubt the flank, which basically means make a backwards L and to turn. And as you'd mentioned earlier, Dave, these weren't really trained regulars. There was a 3rd Independent Company, which was Continental Army, but the vast majority were the frontiersmen, they were the farmers. So they have to physically stop aiming and shooting at one force that's aiming and shooting at them, turn their backs to them, trust that the men behind them will cover them, and then redoubt and face a new threat coming at them. Not easy enough for anyone to do, much less when you don't have formal military training. But not only that, with the chaos and the noise and the smoke and everything that these weapons made, someone misheard it as retreat instead of redoubt. So, and that spread through the lines like wildfire. Yes. And so it just goes through, retreat, retreat, retreat. So instead of turning now, the whole left flank is actually running. And the other units, as you go on down the line and go towards the riverbank on the right side, are looking and seeing everyone else fleeing and thinking, well, clearly we misheard something, so they begin fleeing. And now the Iroquois have the Americans right where they want them because they want it to be one-on-one. They want it to be hand-to-hand. That's right in their wheelhouse. And so now at this point, you have several miles from where the fort was to where the battle was. Men are trying to basically sprint through the wilderness, through the Great Road to get there, or swim across the river to Fort Wilkes-Barre, which is now where Public Square is, roughly. So you have several miles in either direction, and it did not work. The most common number of casualties was 360 men that died.
Wow.
To put that into perspective, the entire valley, the 5 townships, only had about 2,800 settlers at the time. So you lost a significant portion of the valley in 40 minutes.
So on this walking tour, though, will basically cover just about everything in a 2-mile
Yes.
hike.
Yes. We're going to start you at Fort Street. We're going to take you to where they fanned out. We're going to take you to where the flanking maneuver took place. Steve actually has the people try to form the redoubt, and he explains all of that. Then we turn around and he shows you a few of the paths that it went.
Yeah.
And we touch on the Bloody Rock. We touch on Fort Wintermoot because that was in the same area.
Rock is still there, by the way.
Yes.
Covered with a protective grate so that
it doesn't get any smaller than it already is.
Right.
Yeah.
They had to do that with Plymouth Rock, too.
Yes.
Yeah, they had to put a grate around it.
Yeah. So it's...
Well, that's a great event. Again, the
It
dates
is.
for that now.
That is, I believe, the 14th and 15th of September. It's that Saturday and Sunday. I'm pretty sure it's 14th. 14th, 15th, or 15th and 16th, whatever the Saturday and Sunday is. And the tours are at 1 p.m. both days. And it's the same price, $7 for members, $10 for non-members for that. For that, we actually do encourage reservations because they fill up, and we try not to have more than 35 or 40 people.
Sure.
If there is a demand, we can add a second tour on a day. That's not a problem. This way we like to know, not that we have 100 people traversing through Wyoming Ave. So that we do encourage you to call ahead on.
Great events. Are you planning to have the Ghost Walks again in October this year?
We are working right now to either have the Ghost Walks, and if we don't have those, we may bring back our Victorian Death and Mourning event at the Sweatland House, which we've done in the past as well, where we actually reenact Maggie Sweatland, who was one of William's daughters. She perished in Philadelphia, and they actually she was one of the first people to be embalmed in the area that we know of, because it was during the Civil War and embalming had started. So she was actually embalmed and sent back up to the house and laid out in the parlor. That's actually where the term funeral parlor came from, because that's where you would have your funerals. And then she was buried in 40 Fort. So we reenact her funeral. We talk about some of the traditions, cutting the hair of the deceased, making wreaths out of them, making jewelry.
Sure.
So we will have a Halloween event this year.
Okay.
Not 100% on which one.
Before we run out of time, because we're getting a little close, I want to remind folks that the museum has an awful lot to offer, and the presentations change from time to time.
Yes.
What will generally, what's...
Well, currently we have a exhibit on the first floor on fraternal organizations in the Wyoming Valley, your Masons, your Knights Templar, your Knights of Columbus, your Odd Fellows. Upstairs, we still have, for a few more months till the end of the summer, till the end of September, we have the Battle of Wyoming at 240. Last year was the 240th anniversary.
Right.
It's been popular enough that we're keeping it up until at least Labor Day and probably through the end of September. And then we also have our Native Americans in the Wyoming Valley exhibit. That's a permanent exhibit, so that will be up forever. So we have 3 current exhibits that are up. It's $5 for non-members for the museum. It's free for members, and it's a good way to kill an afternoon if you're downtown.
What are the hours of the museum?
It is 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. on Saturdays.
Now, we've covered a whole lot of things here, including the museum itself. A site where people can get information on each of these events and future events that are coming up?
We have a newly refurbished website. We just redid it, www.luzernehistory.org. It has everything you need on there, and likewise, we have a Facebook page. Just go to Facebook and type in Luzerne County Historical Society, and all our events are on there as well.
And I believe, just from the ghost walks that I mentioned, you've been getting some pretty good response from the public on these things.
Oh yes, we've been very blessed with the response we've been getting. Even with the battle walks already, we've been getting quite a few responses. We started doing meditation classes in the museum. Those far exceeded any expectations for attendees we had. Our earlier summer tours of the Sweatland Homestead, I mean, we're averaging almost 20 people a day for something that we just started.
You have to give the public what they want. The paranormal has never been bigger, you know,
Yes.
with every channel
Popular.
having ghost hunters, ghost finders,
Yes.
ghost adventurers. It's true. You have to strike
One
while the
final-
iron's hot.
One final question. Are you getting the young people involved in our history?
We have noticed a definite upturn in it, which is wonderful to see. And it's like anything else, half of it is getting them in the door. Once you get a child inside and they
interest.
learn
Absolutely.
about
Yeah.
this, the interest is there.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of doing something to attract them, or oftentimes doing something to attract their parents to
Yeah.
bring them
Yeah.
there.
I've
good
often
point.
been baffled by a
point.
reluctance to fall into history because the same people say, I don't like reading history, would love to go and see an adventure movie.
Yes.
And history is filled with adventure,
Yes,
and
exactly.
it actually
Right.
have true. Hey, thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you,
Great
Mark.
event.
Good
Thank you,
luck.
gentlemen.
Yeah, I think it's going to work out. We'll look forward to seeing you back here again.
Absolutely.
And
See you
thank
next
you so
week.
much for us.
Okay,
Okay,
Dave.
Mark
See you,
McGlory,
Mark.
thank you
Thank
for
you,
all your
Mark.
work behind the scenes. I'm David DeCosmo for ECTV Live. Till we see you again next time, here's hoping all your news is good.